Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank the Manitoba Brain Injury Association for inviting me to speak today. Today, I'm going to talk about brain injury and dementia. And my outline for today's talk is the following. We'll first look at some of the characteristics of brain injury. We'll look at some of the different types, and we'll ask the important question if brain injury leads to dementia. And we'll continue to look at brain injury and specifically look at some examples in Alzheimer's disease. We'll also look at some other research examples that are very recent. We'll talk a little bit about TBI and drug treatments and other treatments. And then we'll look at some ways to prevent dementia in general. And finally, we'll conclude about what's new in TBI research. I do want to make this disclosure. I'm a neuroscientist and professor, but I'm not a physician. I have a PhD, not an MD. So if you need medical advice on your specific type of TBI, please talk to your physician directly. All right, let's get started. So there are many different types of brain injuries. These include traumatic brain injury, or TBI, stroke. There are different types of cerebrovascular accidents that can occur. Blast injury, the type that we see in explosions, and sometimes soldiers can experience this in combat. Hypoxia, which is due to a shortage of oxygen in the brain. Also from infections or metabolic changes. Conditions such as hydrocephalus. And also there's a specific type called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is the type of injury that's been ascribed to prize fighters and boxers. And there are other types as well. So what is the leading cause of traumatic brain injury? And we can see from this graph that it's actually due to falls. And since our elderly are at greater risk for falling, this is a risk factor for those that are elderly for having traumatic head injury. And you can also see that motor vehicle accidents or car accidents are close behind. So now I want to talk a little bit about the transition of brain injury, and we'll introduce the terms primary and secondary injury in traumatic brain injury. So what is primary injury? Well, primary injury is the blunt impact that's experienced or felt when a ball hits your head or you fall to the ground and hit your head. It can also be a projectile. So it could be a bullet entering the skull and the brain or some other source of penetration. So overall, it's some sort of mechanical force that's applied to the skull and affects the brain. We also have another phase called secondary injury. And in the brain, secondary injury develops over hours to days and even to months. And during the secondary injury process, we have a number of biochemical cascades that are triggered. And because of this, we have a change in cell function. So here's the overall pattern. We can see that we initiate some sort of primary injury, a blunt impact at time 0 here. And that with regard to secondary injury, we have two phases, the acute phase, which is usually within the first week or so, and the so-called chronic phase, which is after 7 days, which can last up to weeks, months, or even years later. And we have different characteristics for both the acute phase and the chronic phase. So overall, we begin with some sort of mechanical trauma to the skull. During the acute phase, we have cell death. And you can see that's indicated here by this red shaded area under the curve. And then as we transition to the chronic phase, we can see that there's inflammatory responses that are triggered. And that's shown here by this dashed line. And this can extend for quite a long period of time too. Then the other curve we see is a black dotted line. And this is referring to a variety of different regenerative processes in the brain, including neuroplasticity. And of course, there are a lot of other signs and symptoms associated with brain injury in general: headaches, confusion, balance issues, pupil size changes, slurred speech, seizures, bleeding and hemorrhaging, sometimes the loss of consciousness, changes in diet and motivation, and even sometimes depression. So here's a slide showing some of my past research using MRI scanning of head trauma. This is in a rat model of TBI, and this is using a high field magnet system, a 7 Tesla MRI system that was quite novel at the time. I did this research while I was at Georgetown University, and there were a couple different objectives in this research. One was to look at the time course of brain injury and also try to correlate the MRI findings with histopathology or samples from tissue. And you can see in the graph at the right, the figure on the right, we show a big arrow here, red arrow, pointing out the dark areas, these hypointense areas. These are areas of cavitation, basically creating holes in the brain from the primary injury. So the blunt impact itself can create disruption in the brain that happens almost immediately. And then over time, we developed the so-called secondary injury effects. And in this study, what we did was to characterize different forms of edema. And we can visualize that right here. You can see this red arrow. We're visualizing some of the edema. And the edema shows up not as dark areas, but actually bright areas. We refer to this as a hyperintensity. And these bright areas are actually areas, regions of interest of edema. And in this study, we transitioned from different types of edema, cytotoxic edema, and then we also looked at vasogenic forms of edema. So this whole experiment was done to characterize and follow the temporal evolution of primary and secondary injury. So we want to ask the question if brain injury can lead to dementia. But before we do that, we really have to define what dementia is. And dementia is actually an umbrella term because there are many different types of dementia. My mother actually experienced dementia, and she seemed to acquire it from her bout with congestive heart failure. So this is a picture of my mom on the right and my kids when she was in the rest home. And so my mom was hospitalized with congestive heart failure for about a week and a half. And after getting through that, she was diagnosed with profound dementia. So like I said, there are many different types of dementia. Alzheimer's disease is actually the leading type of dementia. I'm guessing that my mom probably had a type of vascular dementia, either caused by multiple strokes or some other cerebrovascular change. And you can see that the percentage of vascular dementia is a bit less. So Alzheimer's disease dementia can be anywhere between 60 to 70% in this pie chart. So it's quite a large portion of the different types of dementias. And there are other types as well, including mixed dementia, dementia with Lewy bodies, frontal temporal dementia, and so on. And you can see that in some cases that dementia is not actually characterized by memory loss as it is in Alzheimer's. So for example, in frontal temporal lobe dementia, the onset actually occurs between the ages of 45 and 60, whereas in Alzheimer's disease, usually most people experience memory loss and other signs of Alzheimer's after the age of 65. So there are differences amongst the different types of dementias. So like I said, the most common type of dementia is Alzheimer's disease, and aging is the greatest risk factor, although Alzheimer's disease is not a part of the normal aging process. But we also have to remember that Alzheimer's disease is actually a multifactorial condition. And what we mean by that is that there are many different factors that can contribute or cause Alzheimer's disease that we're still trying to understand. Plaques and tangles are the two classic hallmarks that scientists have been studying over the years. These protein deposits are complex mixtures of different types of toxic proteins. And then also these tangles that form, and the tangles are a chemical alteration of another protein called tau. And what happens when this protein is chemically altered is that there are microtubules and organelle in the cell that get disrupted. And the microtubules are similar to highways. The interstate systems in the United States carry cargo and trucking, and of course we need cargo to be shipped from one place to another. And this is similar in the cell, is that microtubules will carry cargo to different parts of the cell, and when this transport is disrupted by changes in tau, then cell function can be affected. So one of the factors that we have suspected over the years, and we're still collecting evidence on this, is that TBI, or traumatic brain injury, might be one risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. Now here's a particular study that was published pretty recently in January 2018, and this was published in the journal called PLOS Medicine. And in this particular study, They were looking at the risk of dementia and determining if it was higher for more severe types of or multiple head traumas as compared to mild TBI. So they looked at 3 different groups. This study was conducted in Sweden. And in the first group, they examined over 164,000 participants. And these were people that had a TBI, and they were compared to others in a control group. There's also a second cohort that was examined with over 136,000 participants. And in this case, these patients had dementia diagnosis. They were also compared to a control group. And then in the third cohort, there were over 46,000 participants. And in this case, they were pairs of siblings where one had received a TBI diagnosis, but the other had not. So those were the 3 groups. So what they did is they looked more carefully at these 3 groups, and they found a number of interesting things. First, the researchers found that the risk of dementia was actually highest during the first year after the injury. During this time, they also saw that people who had a prior TBI were actually 4 to 6 times as likely to get a dementia diagnosis as those without traumatic brain injury. And finally, what they found is that the overall risk decreased over time, but TBI patients still face a higher risk than those without TBI, even up to 30 years later. So this is a very interesting observation in this study. So the other question that we can ask here, does brain injury actually lead to more specific types of dementia like Alzheimer's disease? And in some cases, it seems like it does, but scientists don't know all the details yet. So here's another study that was published just in August 2019. And in this case, they were looking at old brain injuries, trying to understand if it was a cause of dementia, and specifically asking the question, was it Alzheimer's disease? So this included 40 patients at UCLA, California, in the United States. The average age was just under 68 years old, and all had suffered some sort of traumatic brain injury. And all these patients also developed memory problems going forward. So this is a very nice image showing all the PET scanning that was done. And what this slide points out is that most damage in this study was actually confined to the ventral diencephalon, which is a brain region associated with learning and emotions. So what they found is that Alzheimer's disease appeared less likely in this study, which is a very surprising observation. So specifically, there seemed to be less atrophy occurring in the hippocampus, which is a region involved in memory and emotions. It's actually a brain region we study in my lab. And what's important to know is that the hippocampus is actually one of the primary brain regions that's most affected in Alzheimer's disease. So in this study, it wasn't the primary region. And so we have to conclude that Alzheimer's disease was not the major outcome. So what else does traumatic brain injury do? Well, studies have shown that it can accelerate age-related volume loss and other age-related phenomenon, but it accelerates it. Women also seem to have worse outcomes after TBI than men, but more work is needed. We need more evidence on sex-based differences in head trauma. We've found over the years that there are a variety of neurodegenerative diseases that can be manifested from a head trauma, not only different types of dementia, but also ALS. But scientists and physicians, like I mentioned before, are not yet in total agreement about which type of neurodegenerative disease or condition are actually most likely following a TBI. Is it Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's disease and so on? So these details are still being clarified. And sometimes, of course, we see different personality changes and the onset of depression in TBI patients. There are a number of drugs that have been used to treat TBI after it's occurred. These are different classes of drugs that I list here. The diuretics that are used to reduce the fluid in the tissue, like we saw in one of the slides. We mentioned the word edema, which is really an accumulation of fluid. And there's pressure that builds up in the brain because of this edema. And so these diuretics can reduce that fluid and reduce the pressure. In other cases, surgery is needed. Also, sometimes we see seizures occurring with head trauma, and so anticonvulsants that are used for epilepsy are sometimes used for the seizures that are manifested in TBI. Also, in some serious cases, sometimes coma is induced, and so coma-inducing drugs for decreasing the oxygen needs to the brain might be used. And the class of amphetamines are used for trying to treat the attention deficit that sometimes we see in head trauma. And also Parkinson's disease drugs are used for changes in motor function or movement. And other drugs are used as well. So here's another slide showing some of my past research. This was in rats, and in this case, we measured electrical activity in rats that had experienced a head trauma, and we tested different drugs. And in particular, we tested the drug cyclosporin. And cyclosporin is a drug that belongs to the class of drugs called immunosuppressants, and these drugs also can reduce inflammation. Another function of cyclosporin is to modulate mitochondrial function, the organelle that supplies energy to the cells. So in this study, we obtained normal electrical recordings that can be seen in this upper trace in the panel on the left. And then after head trauma, we could see that the electrical readout looked quite different, and we see multiple spikes, which is an indication of seizure-like activity. And we also see a reduction in the amplitude, the size of the spike in this readout, which indicates that there's been an impairment in synaptic plasticity. So what we did in the study was to look at 4 different groups. We looked at control versus head trauma rats, and then in some cases we looked at treatment versus those rats that received no treatment with cyclosporin. And we can see when we use high frequency stimulation at 100 hertz, and we use this to simulate learning and memory, or in other words, inducing synaptic plasticity, we can see the black bar is the control level, but that in the animals that were subjected to head trauma, we see a serious reduction in the amount of the electrical activity we normally would record, which is an indicator of an impairment in synaptic plasticity. However, when we treat with cyclosporin, we have a pretty much equivalent levels of population amplitude responses. So the cyclosporin appears to work. In this next slide, we're looking at some other past research I had conducted. This is using MRI again, and also looking at drug testing. But this was in a stroke model in baby rats. And so we can see a number of images on the left that were taken at 7 days. And again, this hyperintense or bright area is an area or region of the brain that indicates the edema and the water that's accumulating after during the secondary injury process. We also looked at the adult rat, and at 90 days, the injury was still there. So it takes a long time for the secondary injury processes to clear themselves. And then finally, in this cartoon on the right, we have a drug treatment. And in this case, we use MK-801, which is a drug that appeared to reduce the brain injury volume by up to 50%. So if we compare the drug images to the other images, you can see a reduction in the volume of the injury, and we can also see that the hyperintense area has been reduced dramatically as well. So what are some of the drugs that are used to treat Alzheimer's disease? This slide lists the FDA-approved drugs, and we can see that some of these drugs are used at different stages, mild to moderate and also moderate to severe Alzheimer's. There are really only 4 drugs, and the 5th drug that we list here is actually a combination of 2 of the above drugs. The last drug to be approved by the FDA for Alzheimer's was actually in 2003. So let's look at some facts and figures for TBI and dementia, basically some evidence that links TBI to dementia, and this is provided by the Alzheimer's Association in the United States. So studies have shown that TBI increases the risk for dementia, including Alzheimer's disease. However, no data so far suggests that a single mild TBI, let me say that again, a single mild TBI increases dementia risk. risk for dementia will increase with the number of TBIs sustained. So in other words, the more you have, the more your risk will increase, even if they're mild TBIs. In fact, mild TBI was associated with an increased risk for 2 times. So an increased risk of dementia compared to those with no prior TBI was increased by 2 times. The greatest risk for developing CTE that we mentioned before was repetitive brain trauma, and this is in the case with boxers. And CTE, interestingly, is also characterized by tangles, similar to what we see in Alzheimer's disease. Some research also suggests that TBI is more likely to cause dementia in those with the ApoE gene, especially if you inherit copies from both your mother and your father. So what can you do to prevent dementia? Well, first, we really need to say that not everyone with TBI will develop a dementia. That's an important point. And you can reduce your risks of certain dementias by keeping a healthy weight and also by keeping your blood pressure low. So overall, lifestyle modifications can reduce your risk for Alzheimer's actually by 30 to 50%. So modifications like blood pressure control, proper exercise, the MIND diet, which is a combination of the Mediterranean diet and the DASH diet, characterized by lots of fruits and vegetables, leafy greens, and so on, by not smoking, blood sugar control, and also by reducing inflammatory triggers. Also, we can increase cognitive reserve, which will reduce risk before TBI and also after TBI. So what we mean by cognitive reserve is appropriate brain stimulation and our level of education. So by having a career that's complex intellectually, or by going to college and keeping our brains active, especially as we age, will increase our cognitive reserve and build resistance and resilience in the brain before or after a head trauma. So let's talk a little bit more now about what's new or trending in TBI research. Well, first, there's the saliva biomarkers that are being used more in children and in adolescents that experience concussion. And so a quick swab can be done, which is more non-invasive than a blood test, to find out if a concussion actually occurred, and also to give us some information on the severity of the concussion. There's also blood-based biomarkers that are used more and more these days for sports concussion. And then finally, from a scientifically, for studying TBI more rigorously, there's neuroimaging, such as I showed you in some of my slides before, but specifically to look at neuroinflammation after head trauma. Also, there are eye tracking devices that are being used, and these are being used also to determine the severity of head trauma. And sometimes these sorts of measurements are used in a court of law. New helmets are being engineered for hockey and for football that will reduce the consequences of TBI. And then also helmet sensors have been introduced both in the military and in sports in order to measure different physical characteristics associated with the head trauma associated or with the blast, measuring acceleration of the brain and these sorts of things. So if you want links for more information, this slide shows you not only one of our recent review papers that talks about head trauma and Alzheimer's, but also some other sources of information from the Manitoba Brain Injury Association, Brain Injury Canada, the Alzheimer's Society, and the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. So I'd like to thank for my lab staff that contributed to this, some of the slides here today. And also, I'd like to thank my funding sources over the years that have contributed to supporting my projects. So thank you for listening. If you have any questions, I encourage you to call either my phone numbers or to email me at the contact information below. Thank you for listening.